welcome to everybody who's signed in and yet to sign in. This event is being recorded for the Click Photo Festival and will be archived on our YouTube channel. I always like to start off first with thanking 21C. Nell's here with us. We've had a long partnership with 21C over the years. Nell and I brainstormed on a series of talks to coincide. They have a wonderful exhibition called The Future is Female. And so we have put together 3 different women creators to do talks. We've already had Rhonda Klavansky speak. Tonight we have Tamika Galanis, and then next week we have Margaret Sarter. I'm going to put in the chat window the Eventbrite a sign up. That is a live event. People can come. We had a sellout for Rhonda's. It was wonderful. Again, that is on October 27th. There's also at 21C along their Main Street window vitrines, there's a series of images and a slideshow related to our exhibition Persevere, which is outside at the sculpture park at NCMA. We have 3 beautiful images and a slideshow at 21C. The slideshow looks really great at night, and the windows look wonderful. And of course, the exhibition at 21C is fantastic, and there's a lot of photography in it. So check that out. We are winding down the Click Festival. There are only a handful of events remaining. One of them is this Sunday. It is a Zoom event. There's an exhibition at PS 118 called From Fallujah. It was curated by John Bechtold, who is getting his PhD at UNC. He's a former soldier in Afghanistan, and he's curated work by 4 young photographers in Fallujah in Afghanistan, showing not war-torn Fallujah, but life in Fallujah. And these 4 photographers are going to join us from Afghanistan with John and scholar interpreter Noor Ghazi. That is another Zoom event. I'm also going to post the registration for that in the chat right there. And then really the final thing of the festival, the National Museum is doing their annual Rothschild Lecture, and we have New York-based photographer Renee Cox speaking. That is Thursday, October 28th at 3 p.m. and that's a Zoom event. So I'm going to type that registration in the chat. And of course, you can always go to our website and find these things as well. Let me see, any other business? Oh, as Tamika talks, there's going to be some time at the end for questions. The way we would like to do it is anyone in the audience who has a question, we would prefer if you write that question out in the chat, and at the end, I'll read them off to Tamika. All right, a brief introduction. Tamika is joining us from her native Bahamas tonight. We had the pleasure of having her here in Durham while she was earning her Master of Fine Arts in Experimental and Documentary Arts from Duke University. She considers herself a documentarian and multimedia visual artist. Her work really is, it transcends sort of straight photography. It really uses all kinds of materials. Her photo-based practice includes traditional documentary work, new media abstractions of written, oral, and archival histories. Much, but not all, much of what she addresses is about the importance of Bahamian cultural identity for cultural preservation, largely in a place shrouded in tourism's ideal during an age of climate concerns. She's currently has several shows up and one in the works. She has a show called the Oceans and Its Interpreters at the Hongam Museum in Taipei, Taiwan. She has a show opening November 2nd at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas called Double Dutch. And also at Turn Gallery, she's got a show called The Other Side of the Pentaprism. She's a little bit busy. And we are honored to have her here tonight with us, with Click. I'm now going to turn the stage over to you, Tamika. Welcome.
Thank you, Bryce, for the warm welcome. Thank you to Click Photo Fest, and thank you to 21C for having me. I'd just like to mention, Bryce, that while I wish all of those were solo shows, they're all group shows, the last one being a joint show with Trinidadian artist Roselle Warner in the Double Dutch series at the National Art Gallery that will open on November 2nd. Okay, so I think the format I'm going to follow, and I hope I'm not speaking too loudly because I have these headphones on. I feel like I'm compensating a little bit. Nell's telling me, no, it's okay. Okay, great. I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice, talk about this directive, The Archive is Now, and then I think we're going to take a look at work as I go through this rundown of exactly what's happening. But first, let's talk about the basis of this practice. I'd say to sum things up, one, I have a traditional documentary photography storytelling practice. And like Bryce mentioned, I do have experimental work that is new media abstractions of, let's say, archival histories, but all that stuff is included in there. I'm going to talk a little bit about what drives the traditional work. And I'd say the overarching umbrella of this work is really called hacking the narrative. Like Bryce mentioned, I do live in a place, and I see a couple people from the Caribbean have signed in a place that is shrouded in this veil, this paradisiacal narrative about what living in the Caribbean is like, what the Caribbean lived experience is like, and it is so much more than this. I like to call it the paradise myth. The public identity, Dr. Krista Thompson calls it place image for this region, really was shaped by image making since the advent of the camera. 1838, the camera comes into being. 1838 is the end of apprenticeship. Throughout the Anglophone Caribbean, we make this transition from a focus on slavery to a focus on tourism. And that narrative has been the narrative that we have lived with since that time. And photography made that all possible. If that at all interests you, there's a really good book written by Dr. Krista Thompson. She is a Bahamian scholar. It's really accessible and well mapped out just how systematically this thing happens, this commodification of the tropics through image. So all the images that drive what people think that living in the Caribbean is like was driven by colonial commissions, right? Because at that time, the people who had the power and the resources and the equipment had to be commissioned by the crown. So what we now know as the colonial images that are a part of our national archives, I mean, they're beautiful, right? But of course, they're heavily troped because they are all taken by people who possess an outsider's lens. And we see this practice repeat itself even now. So we're talking 1838 to 2021, we're still pushing the same image of what it's like to visit, what it's like to be in the Bahamas. And those two things get conflated, right? People who come here for vacation automatically assume that that is the life that people who live here also live, but that is absolutely not the case. So what really drives this work for me is we should be concerned about archival futurities. We're talking about, for us in the Bahamas, it's the lowest elevation coastal zone in the Caribbean. Every time, and it's pouring right now, and every time we get a light little rain, our downtown is flooded. The idea of forced migration is not an idea, it's a reality. It's, for me, it's not an issue of if, but when. And we live in a time where we have the technology, the access, and the self-awareness to be responsible for development of our own archive for the future. We've had an uptick in storm activity, I'd say from 2015 onward, and 2019 Hurricane Dorian was really an example of what, and I'm gonna say worst case scenario. It's been the worst case scenario for us in this generation of exactly how disastrous, excuse me, how disastrous a storm could be for us. And the islands that were affected in the northwestern Bahamas are much larger than the island where I live, where the capital is, which is a tiny, tiny space in the north, well, really the central Bahamas. And if something like that would have happened, if a storm the magnitude of Dorian were to hit New Providence, where I live, then all of this as a lived experience would be completely done for. Our brothers and sisters in the Pacific Islands are having the same experience. In the Solomons and the Marshalls, they have already begun to have what we see as this forced migration and having to move from one place to another. So here we count things a little bit differently, right? When we think about what a forced migration would mean, we're talking about a displacement of people, and we're talking about a displacement of culture. When people are forced to move, you know, what can we take with us? Well, there are certain things that are intrinsic, but there are things that are not going to be available as readily available as they are while we're here. You know, I talk a lot about in hurricane seasons, we count the year by hurricane seasons. We know from June 1st until the end of November that there's all likelihood that things can change for us. And throughout the entire Caribbean, things have shifted from 2015 to 2021. We could very easily wake up and the idea of what we have known for a very long time is different. I said the other day in an interview that it's not only a concern for culture, but it's also for landscape. While we, especially us in the Bahamas, have a problem with food security because most of our products have to be imported just because of where we are, right? Like we don't produce agriculturally on a scale where we would be able to feed everyone. But one of the very nice things about living in this kind of community and in this climate is that you quite often can walk outside your front door and pick something fresh from a tree. And if you don't have it, then you have extended family that has it. If you don't have extended family that has it, you have neighbors who have it, or you can buy it at the grocery store, right? A forced migration to another climate that is not as advantageous for growing the kind of foods that we have grown to know and love our entire lives means that we are stepping away again from what we know culturally through forced migration. So I say all of this, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling. I say all of this to say we should be thinking about archival futurities because this experience is much more ephemeral than a lot of us would like to admit. And documenting everything means that we get to hold on to something when this place is either much different than we remember it or not hospitable for living at all. Okay. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and show you a few images from my traditional body of documentary photography work and share my screen here. These images are from a project within the Hacking the Narrative project called The Constituency. And I think you can see here, going to full screen. Some of these images have been on view at the Center for Documentary Studies, at the National Museum for Art, and at the Rubenstein at Duke. This is, most of these images are from historically recognized neighborhoods, which are in Nassau proper. So the population is a little bit more dense, but these are the same neighborhoods that also have this contentious relationship with imaging from the mid 1800s to, going forward. I think it's important not only to, and I think I said this before, not only to capture these images because, we are looking at a future that's quite uncertain, but because we also need to be countering the narrative of the historical archive. Like I said, we have the tools, we have the access, and we have the resources for us now to create a more self-determined image rather than images that are heavily troped, that historically represent us. I know, I'm not going to be around in 2121, but I hope by 2121 we are still here and that we have images that are more reflective of who we are as a people, as we know it, as a lived experience is outlined right now. So this is Mama Ruth, and she is this was taken in 2016. At the time, she was one of the oldest people on West Street, and she is photographed in front of her milk stand, which we don't see very many of these around Nassau proper anymore, but there is a long history of milk stands in both Bain and Grants towns. I'm going to go through all of these photos, may not give details, but please, if you do want me to stop or go back to something, note it in the chat and we'll come back to it. This is a photograph of a spice market that is at Potter's Key Dock. Potter's Key Dock is where most of it's like a hub for our inter-island boat travel. Goods travel between, up and down the archipelago, between the capital and our family islands. I don't like to use the phrase out islands, but our family islands. So there's this trade, inter-island trade that happens here. And this is where locals go for fresh seafood and entertainment that is kind of off the beaten path for the tourist population. The thing that I like about this is that there's a number of native things in this photograph. I don't know if my mouse will come up with showing your screen, but we've got dried conch here. We've got hog plums and peppers and yams and limes and all that stuff. What's really important to me about this photograph is that this area is not the same. Every time the government gets this hair to come up with some new beautification project for tourism, it changes space for local vendors. And this is one of those that absolutely does not look the same as it did in this photograph from 2016. This is dirty. So this is a crack conch stand. This is also in Bain. Well, this one's in Baintown. This place is, let's see how I can translate it for you. This is a space that's iconographic in Bahamian culture. This is where we would eat our club food. This is where you go to get everything fried after you're leaving the club and it's time to go home, but also like throughout the day. Like Bahamians, if it's anything that we're familiar with, it's conch, and we will dirty stood for a long time, still does, as a large part of the Bahamian cultural iconography. This is a normal scene. You'll see tables full of older men playing dominoes just about in every corner you can think of in Nassau proper. The lovely thing about this photograph is it's from Potter's Key Dock, and this see-through to the ocean here, to the yacht club in the back has been refaced through this beautification project by the government. So it does not look the same anymore. But these fellows have moved across the street and taken up another space. Up the boys from Hospital Lane. Somebody said to me once that they could smell this photograph. I met this group of guys cleaning fish at Montague Dock, which is on the eastern end of the island, where locals go to pick up their fresh seafood. Cleaning Kong, same spot. Uncle Jim is a gentleman I met when I was doing some archival research in Cat Island, which is one of our family islands. The lovely thing about this photograph and the one that's going to follow it, you know, they both said to me that they wanted to be involved in their posing. He absolutely would not take his photograph without his pipe. And this is Miss Hart. Miss Hart is plaiting straw again for inter-island trade that's going to come to the capital. But she shared that, you know, she never wanted to leave Cat Island. She was an island girl. She never had a desire for the city life. So, and this is what I mean when I talk about cultural preservation too, right? I was engaging her in this conversation, and she has this struggle, and I don't think she ever took her eyes off of me. And she just keeps her hands moving and keeps this process going, but decided she'd stop and pose for this photo for me. So that's about it for the traditional documentary practice. I do want to talk about the second part in mining the archives. So in 2018, I was awarded a an Alan Lomax Fellowship at the Kluge Center to work with materials from the American Folklife Center with the Alan Lomax Archive. So just in case folks are in here who don't know who Alan Lomax is, he's a famous ethnographer, ethnomusicologist, anthropologist, whose dad had a big hand in establishing the American Folklife Center in 1935 on the guidance of Zora Neale Hurston. Ended up in the Bahamas for the summer of 1935, documenting in Cat Island, Bahamas, Mangrove Key, and New Providence. So these photographs that I'm going to show you are from Cat Island, Bahamas. When I arrived at the archive in 2018, the archive was 84 years old at the time. And the photographs that I picked for this presentation were people who we were able to identify, who were previously listed as unnamed in the archive for all of those years. And this work is going to lead into the explanation for the next work. So bear with me here for a second. This photograph is a photograph of, and I think it's most likely, his name is Henry Williams, and I'll say why most likely. I had a conversation with a lady in Cat Island who was 88 years old at the time, and I saw this photograph when I first landed in Cat Island, and I met this guy who was wearing the same face. And I said to him, you know, I want to have a conversation with you. I think you really look like this guy in the archive, which is how most of this identification process was driven, right? Heavily reliant on genetics and phenotype. When I arrived in, that's kind of what drove my questions. And I showed him the photograph and he didn't see it. He agreed with me. He agreed that he maybe saw some sort of resemblance, but he didn't think that there was anyone close. So I sit down with this lady who is 88 years old, who happens to be the wife of Uncle Jim, the guy in the photograph with the pipe. And we scroll to this image and she goes, oh, look at Abner. And I said, well, who is Abner? And she said, well, that's the father of the guy who I'd approached and said, hey, I think this photograph looks a lot like you. Can you take a look at it for me? So we did the math, and the math wasn't exactly on point. But what we can determine is that Abner is quite possibly the baby in his hands, and this is probably Abner's father, Henry Williams. Once I had conversations with other family members, did the math, absolutely confirmed it has to be him. One of the things that really, really, and I can't say haunting because this was a life-changing experience, but everybody was really wearing almost the same face as these people in this archive. I was talking to somebody the other day and kind of comparing it to the experience of what that show Dark that's on a streaming service. I can't remember which one, but it was just really uncanny how these people bore the same resemblance too and made this trip so successful. So this is Henry Williams. This is Charlotte Wilson, also listed in the archive previously as unnamed, identified by both her granddaughters, who are elderly women who now live in Cat Island. This is Lillian and John Ambrister, also listed as unnamed for 84 years, identified by John's sister and the stepdaughter of Lillian. This photo was the lady that's front and center, Elizabeth Austin. They called her Mama Lou. I included her in this presentation because her voice appears so many times in the sound archive that I was working with here. And even though she's named in the archive through photography, it did not really stand out until I started talking to locals and people identified her as Mama Lou, and we were able to put the two together. A real funny story about two people in this photograph. Excuse me, let's go back. This lady here on the right hand side. So fast forward to 2021, June of 2021, I was visiting my dad in Atlanta and I got a text message that somebody had visited a distant cousin. And when I say distant, like we'd met her through Ancestry.com. Had been to see the archive and she really wanted to get in touch with me. The thing that got me moving was that it said that she identified her mother in this archive. And I called her. I had one day to spare on my trip. I called her and she said, absolutely, come over. Let's have a conversation about it. Went to see her. She looks exactly like her mom, like the splitting image, like she's wearing this woman's face, the same face in this photograph. So she identified her mom. I'm going to tell you her name, which is important because she's been listed as unnamed group of people in Cat Island, right? So this lady's name is Edna Drusilla Gibson Seymour, born in 1922 in Cat Island. Not only did she identify her, she identified her twin aunts, Merlene Bain Smith and Mary Bain Boykin, also listed as unknown in the archive. And see this guy that's crouched down behind them? He has a name in the archive, but when I spoke with Joy, she told me, absolutely, you tell them they're wrong, they need to correct it. That is my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, which I do believe because he is the one who's presenting the twins for photograph, right? And his name is John Thomas Gibson. So again, another identification of the unknown. This guy in the back here with the squint and this hat that's different from everybody else. I spoke with the lady who identified her stepmother and stepbrother, the Ambristers from the earlier photo, and she looked at it and she said, that's Reuben Dorset. And I said, Reuben Dorset? And she said, yes, the patriarch, those same people who you're down there staying with. There was a family that adopted me as soon as I landed in Cat Island. I was renting from an apartment from one of them, and I had been doing all this work with them, and they had been helping me adjust to the lived experience on the family island, which is much, much different than living in the city, right? So they had adopted this city girl, and I did not know that an ancestor of theirs was in this archive all along. So Reuben Dorset, and I said to her, how do you know that's him? And she said, well, we checked the math is correct. And she said, well, you know, he always wore that hat that way, and he would always stand with his hand in his kimber like he is. And when I showed it to one of his granddaughters, who absolutely agreed with me about the Henry Williams photo because they're all family, she said, yes, that does look like my granddad. And he, not to mention that, my neighbor who lived next door, who is a grandchild of his, is wearing the exact face, same countenance, everything. So it's through this work in Cat Island that then brings me to the work that's been on the flyer for this event this whole time. And that's a series called I Named Charlotte. Um, so Cat Island, I need to tell you a couple of things about Cat Island. At one time, Cat Island was the heaviest populated island in the archipelago. A historian who lives there calls it the blackest place in the Bahamas. It's held on to more of its African pretensions than any other island throughout the archipelago. And that includes um, being synonymous with Obeah. And for people who don't know what Obeah is, it is an African spiritual practice brought across the Atlantic with us. And so most people associate it with folk magic, but I will tell you, it also has a lot to do with folk medicine, what we call bush medicine. And so I spent a lot of time at plantation ruins in Cat Island because they are much more prevalent on Cat Island than they are anywhere else throughout the archipelago. So in I think it was 2019, Holly Bino, who was then the chief curator at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, reached out for a commissioned work in partnership with the current art studios at Bahama, and said, we want you to make something. And I said, absolutely, I know what I'm going to do. And I made a beeline back for Cat Island. I knew that there was going to be a project around plantations, but I didn't exactly know what it was going to be. So every time I ended up on Cat Island for research, I would also run into this professor from Eckerd College in Florida who had been going back and forth to Cat Island, bringing archaeology and anthropology students for maybe a decade, exploring plantation ruins. And I had already made his acquaintance. So when we ran into each other this time, he said, Tamika, what are you working on? And I said, Alan, I don't know. I'm thinking about these plantation ruins, but I'm also thinking about forms of resistance and bush medicine and wondering why there aren't that many more stories of people poisoning their way to freedom. And he said, Tamika, I'm going to tell you something that's going to blow your mind. And so he asked me if I'd read his article. There's a historic uprising of enslaved peoples from a plantation in Cat Island. Now, I need to give you all these details, so bear with me. The Golden Grove plantation is in the south of Cat Island. The people who adopted me and took me in as soon as I got to Cat Island are direct descendants of those people from that plantation. Most of the people who are in these photographs would be direct descendants of that plantation and surrounding plantations in the area. They all still carry their slaver's last name. This particular story, though, I said and his name was Dr. Alan Myers. It is Dr. Alan Myers. He's still with us. I said to him, I read your paper about this uprising at Golden Grove, and I want to thank you for naming the women, because historically, what we know as a public about this uprising of enslaved peoples is that it was led by an enslaved man by the name of Dick DeVoe. Well, we don't know the details unless we would have done the archival research or read this paper, that there were women who were involved with this uprising. One of those women is Charlotte. Charlotte and Linda are named in the archival records as far as the arrest and the acquittal of these crimes of uprising at Golden Grove. Black Dick was not so lucky. They made an example of him. Something about not wanting to ruffle abolitionist feathers. But I'll tell you what Charlotte did. So Charlotte picked up a rock in defense of Linda when the slaver Hunter was getting ready to shoot at her, and she was ready to defend her. Some of the things that we need to know in this embodiment of Charlotte and in the story that I tell about Charlotte in restoring full humanity to her. When I was talking to Alan about, why there aren't that many accounts of historical accounts of which we know it was happening, but why there weren't that many historical accounts of people poisoning their way to freedom, he gives me this letter from the slaver's daughter just after the trial for this uprising. And she is livid. She doesn't want Charlotte back at the plantation because, and she says in the past 5 years, she has attempted to poison. So she really thinks this out. He's done this before. There are some details in the story where her school also involved in uprising, and a few of the actual her slaver had accused children an orange or an apple or whatever. And so that further inferior. In any event, I want to give Charlotte a present. Okay. So this person who is actually the embodiment of Charlotte is a direct descendant of the plantation, of the people from the plantation.
Okay, folks, it seems like we have temporarily lost Tamika. Oh, she's back. There, she's back. Tamika, you're muted and we lost you for a second.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay, sorry, I think the weather has destabilized the internet connection, but we'll see what we can do here.
Okay.
Let me get back to sharing my screen, 1 second. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I was saying that Felicia Hunter here is a descendant of the plantation where this uprising took place. And it was important for me, include a few things, including this vine that you see her wrapped in, which is what we would call love vine. And we use it both in folk magic and medicine. But the thing that you need to know about love vine is it is everywhere in Cat Island. It is parasitic, it is prevalent, you cannot extract it from its host without maiming it or altogether killing it, which is a lot like the history of well, the legacy of slavery in this region. And especially when we think about imaging and the legacy of slavery in this region. So this one particular photo, is a part of a series called I Named Charlotte. And it's about this woman stepping out of the shadow of Black Dick and actually taking, was someone who had historically taken her freedom into her own hands. All these plants that have taken over the plantation, I mean, roots have dug up and broken the walls, are castor plants. And interesting about the castor plant is it's either medicine or poison, depending on your intent. It's a natural source of cyanide if you don't cook it properly. So this series really is a speculative documentary piece about an enslaved woman and her liberatory practice. This is a photograph of the great house on that plantation and all the plants that are kind of disrupting, the trees that are disrupting, taking back this land. Holly Bino writes a beautiful essay about Obeah and indigenous knowledge and women a lot like Charlotte who had this sort of who have used this and this is seriously dumbing it down when I say folk magic, right? But I do have the link for it and I'm going to leave it in the chat because I think you should read it. There are several women from the Caribbean, several women artists from the Caribbean whose work is included, and I'm happy and proud to be among them. And she really did the Charlotte story justice here. So the Lomax collection took me to Cat Island. Cat Island brought me Charlotte, and it's kind of like I stepped into this time warp when I walked into the archive in 2018, and the dead have not stopped talking since. I'm getting ready to move on to another archival project that I feel like this is where I am now. So when I say the archive is now, it's really a directive with two legs. We need to be thinking about archival futurities, archives of tomorrow that are in the present. And we need to be mining the archives for stories that are longing to be told. I just wanted to share a few more images of other parts of my practice. We're talking about this show that's coming up, Double Dutch, and realizing that I really, really have a penchant for hybridity. These are the human coral hybrids. These are from my thesis show at Duke in 2016. But I bring these up because I want to show you other instances of hybridity that I have employed. This was from a show in 2018 at the Center for Documentary Studies, one hurricane season. And these are family archival photographs paired with seaweed and conch shell and mango leaf. All things that were personally and publicly affected in the hurricane season of 2017. Also poinsettia bark here. So this brings me to the show that's coming up, and this is a preview of the work, and I am back to my hybrids. This show is really about ancestral reverence, and in particular, the silk cotton tree. The silk cotton tree, I think I have a shot. For people who are not familiar with it, is this really, really, really large tree. The ones in the Bahamas appear somewhere around the 1600s when the South Carolinians come in as loyalists to the Queen, and they're hundreds and hundreds of years old. This is a still from a video installation in this new show, and this is about maybe a third of the root system of this tree. The significance about this tree and ancestral worship is they're said to be suppositories for the dead. So in this particular video project, we are petitioning the tree. A woman comes to the tree and she petitions the tree for a spirit back, and in liberating one, she liberates many more. This is another still from the culmination of that film. But yes, so hybrids in this new show, that is a silk cotton pod. Historically, they have been used to caulk boats, to stuff pillows. Can't make clothing from them, but it's the season now and they're everywhere. And these centuries old trees stand as witness to very, very, very many hundreds of years of folk medicine and magical practice. And again, like I say, that's dumbing it down, but I won't go into a whole spiel about what Obeah is and how important Obeah is to my practice and my work. But that's about it. So I think we can go ahead and open up for questions.
Okay, stop sharing your screen so I can read the chat if there is one. And I definitely have a couple questions for you.
Okay.
Off the top. And I apologize in advance, Tamika. My questions tend to be long-winded, so bear with me. So there's a long history of photography that has an agenda, like in your case, tourism. In some cases, it's a preset agenda to talk about crime or poverty, how important do you feel it is, not only in your practice, but in other documentary practices, to have somebody who's on the inside of a community who can peel back the curtain and show another side of any of those stories, and really in any community?
Well, I think lived experience is important, right? Because, and in this particular case, if the Bahamas was wiped off the map today, and that's really macabre to think about, but it could quite possibly happen. We are still in hurricane season. If we were, if if this region became so inhospitable that we had to leave today, the archive of what people would look at to go back and find Bahamians is the colonial historical archive, which is littered with tropes. You know, palm trees, the black market woman, mule drawn carts, the same images from different photographers over and over and over. It does nothing to tell us about what the current lived experience is in the Bahamas. And I'd say that that is the same for just about anywhere, for anybody who is, and especially for people who live in post-colonial states. And I use air quotes because we're supposed to be post-colonial, but it doesn't really feel that way, especially for people that live in regions that are post-colonial states, because counter narratives are important. Most likely the media is not telling a full story, let me say that, a full story of what a lived experience looks like.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I have another question. I think you and I both have taught classes at CDS dealing with archives. And I know in my case, I got handed a huge amount of photographs while my grandfather was on his deathbed.
Oh, wow.
And he was known to have a great memory, but he died 3 days later. And 90% of these photographs had no captions, no names.
Yeah.
And your mission to put names to these archival images, previously unnamed group, whatever.
Right.
Do you not feel like you're a detective in a mystery novel doing that? Like, I mean, I think it's wildly important, and I've embarked upon that myself. Doesn't it feel like that to you when you're trying to, it's important work, but how does it feel tracking down all those leads?
Well, Bryce, I'll tell you that it felt impossible to begin with, right? Because I think as photographers, and especially people who have a certain faculty with images, we have a different experience that we come to archives and collections with than lay people, right?
Right.
For me, I think my faculty with images first started with my own family's archive.
Right.
Like, I didn't realize until I embarked upon that exercise that other people didn't know what their parents looked like as toddlers. I had been looking at my family's archive since I was a teenager. So I knew what my dad looked like as a baby, as a young adult, as a young man. I knew what he looked like as a father. And the same for all his siblings, right? Because his father made sure that there was this archive of, that they had this own personal archival history. And it really, I mean, when I tell you, and this sounds crazy, it really did not dawn on me until I ended up in Cat Island working with this archive that everybody doesn't have that. Even when strangers were saying, yes, this is this person, and I'm telling you, we were peers. I was maybe 6 years old when this expedition happened. I'm telling you why I know who this is. And those family members were not able to back that up and say, yes, absolutely, this is this person. It really was a wake-up call for me. So it felt a little impossible at the beginning, but I will tell you, it's been magical every step of the way since then. I mean, this venture began in 2018, and people always ask me, oh, you're still working on that little project? And I'm like, well, it's not a little project, number one. Number two, I don't think this work is going to be done anytime soon, because there are still so many. And when I tell you that the people in that collection keep talking, I'm 2021. How many years is that later? This woman from ancestry.com gets my number from my uncle and says, I have something for you. And I was leaving the next morning. I dropped everything and said, I'm coming over. And in one fell swoop, what is that, 4 or 5 people in
Right,
the archive?
right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'll spare you my long story too, but I did much the same as you, where, you know, I had a picture of Uncle Ezra from whatever year, and I used my own internal facial recognition. You know, here's another picture unmarked 50 years later. I'm like, well, that's clearly the same guy. And
Right.
it was fascinating. And I talked to everybody I could think of, and it will never end. You know, I will still keep trying to piece together the puzzle that is this mystery. And there are family narratives. And is this a family member, or is it just, it was a friend of the family? I don't know. And it's been fascinating. It's been challenging. It's been frustrating. But for people like you and I, who this kind of thing matters, I feel the same way as you. Other families don't have that. They don't have that concern. They don't have that care. But I think it matters beyond our own family, in your case, to give a greater sense of the history of the Bahamian people. You know, who was what, you know. All right. I think that's a good time to wrap it up. Tamika, thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you,
thank you
Bryce.
so much. We really
Yeah.
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Nell.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. Again, this will be a YouTube archive. Tamika, again, thank you. Nell, thank you for hosting this. Hopefully we'll see everyone again.
Okay.
Bye, y'all.
Good night.